passage is from Genesis 18, verses 1 through 8. One day Abraham was sitting at the entrance to his tent during the hottest part of the day. He looked up and noticed 3 men standing nearby. When he saw them, he ran to meet them and welcomed them, bowing low to the ground. "My Lord," he said, "if it pleases you, stop here for a while. Rest in the shade of this tree while water is brought to wash your feet. And since you've honored your servant with this visit, let me prepare some food to refresh you before you continue on your journey." "All right," they said, "do as you have said." So Abraham ran back to his tent and said to Sarah, "Hurry, get 3 large measures of your best flour, knead it into dough, and bake some bread." Then Abraham ran out to the herd and chose a tender calf and gave it to his servant, who quickly prepared it. When the food was ready, Abraham took some yogurt and milk and roasted meat, and he served it to the men. As they ate, Abraham waited on them in the shade of the trees. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Well, today I want to touch on a topic that not only is important to God, but to every living person on earth. And it's a topic that I think is a key component in probably every growing church. And for those of you who are part of Spirited Joy, this sermon will actually make more sense to you next week when we have our ministry reveal. So remember this one till next week. And the topic is the ability to make new friends. And I'll just tell you how the world needs people who can do this. Barna Research, I don't know if you've ever heard of them, but it's a reputable Christian data gathering organization. And they recently stated that 1 in 3 Americans report feeling lonely at least once a day. I mean, just think of that. 1 in 3 Americans. If we went through all the people in this room, every 3rd person on average in America would say that they feel lonely at least once a day. People need friends. In a Bible study I once led on friendship, it began by asking each person to do a little self-examination. I think it's very important that we do this. The study began by saying this about friendship. It said the core of biblical friendship is seeking the interest of the person you have befriended. So seeking the interest of the person you have befriended. And it goes on to say it is the consistent resistance of the urge to be self-preoccupied. The Apostle Paul puts it this way in Philippians chapter 2. Paul writes, "Don't look out only for your own interests, but take an interest in others too." And so Paul directs us to resist the natural urge to be self-preoccupied with our own interests, our own problems, our own agendas, and to open ourselves up to a life of taking more of an interest in other people. To me, which invites all of us to consider this simple but I think very important question. And that is, what is my level of self-preoccupation? Now, I mean, you can say that to yourself. What's your level of self-preoccupation? And so I'd like you to take a moment to honestly consider that question, because it lies at the center of developing healthy relationships, friendships. And so on a scale of 1 to 10, how much of your life is currently focused on yourself? and you don't have to say anything out loud. And how much of it involves taking a real interest in others? And so in Philippians chapter 2, Paul invites us to take more of an interest in other people. That shift in attitude is a critical first step. And if we don't take that first step, we never get to any of the other ones. And so we have to change our attitudes that we want to be less self-preoccupied and more interested in other people. But once we change our attitude, how do we turn strangers into friends? Well, God doesn't leave us wondering. In Hebrews chapter 13, God gives us these words of advice. In verse 2 we read, "Don't forget to show hospitality to strangers." It says, "For some who have done this have entertained angels without realizing it." And so what is hospitality? This passage gives us our answer by picking out one person for us to consider, and that is Abraham. Because he's the one who showed hospitality to three men who he didn't realize until later were angels. And so Abraham becomes the example of biblical hospitality. He becomes our role model. And the text, which is today's lesson from Genesis chapter 18, the text begins, "One day Abraham was sitting at the entrance to his tent during the hottest part of the day." And the first thing we see in verse 2 is he looked up and noticed three men standing nearby. It says when he saw them, he ran to meet them. And so like us, Abraham finds himself in the midst of some strangers. Probably something that occurs to us probably every day or most days. And so what is Abraham's first response? Notice who makes the first move here. He ran to meet them. And I think this is very important that we pick up on that because in a book entitled How to Start a Conversation and Make Friends, the author gives this advice. He says most shy people take the passive role when it comes to starting conversations. They wait and wait and wait, hoping someone will come along and start a conversation with them. And he says if there's two shy people together, he says they're both waiting, both taking the passive role. And the author then says to get out of this catch-22, he says consciously change from the passive to the active role. And he says be the first to say hello. And so in our daily world filled with strangers, I wonder how many of us most often take the passive role. Because to me, the truth is we can spend much of our lives waiting for other people to make the first move. And probably just as many of them are waiting for us or someone else to make the first move. And just as a point of confession, I can tell you I've done that much of my life. But how much better would our lives be? And how much better other people's lives would be if we were to imitate Abraham here? Abraham makes the first move. It says when he saw them, he ran to meet them. In fact, this author on the Book of Friendship advises us to start each day with just one simple goal. And so think about, we're in this time yet of New Year's resolutions. This might be one you want to write. Here's the simple goal you wake up with. He says, set a goal to make contact with others. So not just necessarily be in their presence. I mean, you're at work or somewhere and you've got people around you. Well, you've made contact in a sense, but he says actually make contact with others. In other words, make it your goal to take the active role, not the passive. The next thing the author says we should do is also clearly seen in Abraham. And that is to consider what our body language is communicating to the stranger. And I find this is so important and we don't even realize it. And so to see this, I invite you to take a look at Abraham's body language here. Take a look at the second sentence in verse 2. It says this about Abraham. It says, when he saw them, he ran to meet them and welcomed them, bowing low to the ground. Now, what do you see in that body language? See, the first thing I see is a man who does a lot of Pilates. Someone who does a whole lot of stretching, because I'll tell you, if I made that move, I'd have a hard time getting back up. Not Abraham. But I also see a person whose body language leaves no doubt that he respects and is interested in these strangers. And this author of the book on making friends touches on this very thing. He says, one of the most important conversational skills doesn't come from our tongue, but from our body. And he says research has shown that over half of face-to-face conversation is nonverbal. He says body language often communicates our feelings and attitudes before we speak. And it projects our level of receptivity to others. He says most poor conversationalists don't realize that their non-receptive body language, and some examples would be crossed arms, little eye contact, no smiling, constantly looking at your watch, or being on your phone texting other people. He says those things are often the cause. And to me, that's what's so exciting about what he says. It's often the cause of short and unsustained conversations. And if you've ever had this experience, you ever talk with someone and they're constantly on their phone with other, what does their nonverbal body language communicate? And especially among strangers, those types of signals can stop friendships before they even start. Because we send out signals to them, even when we're across the room from them, we're sending out signals. In fact, here's an example I'll give. I see people all the time across the room from me on their phones. And it communicates to me, my guess is they're on their phone because they'd love for someone to talk to, but in lieu of that, they'll be on their phone. But you see, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. What they don't want is to be alone, but their doing that sends me the message they don't want to talk. They're on their phone. They're doing something else. So it is a sending of a signal across the whole room that you're non-receptive to getting into a conversation with people. And it'll stop your friendships before they ever get a chance to start. And even in churches, if we want to get personal, And I'm not talking about this church, because I think most of you guys are absolutely phenomenal at this, and this is just a touch-up sermon. A little reminder. But even in churches, I think we can give off nonverbal cues that we're only interested in our current group of friends. Someone walks in, a stranger, and we can be like, look, I'm with the same group after every service, and I ain't budging. And so churches often say we are very loving people. I mean, amongst the group, you're very loving. But to the stranger, they see the opposite. Because the nonverbal cue to you is, I've got enough friends. I don't need you. And so even in churches, we can, not even realizing it, send out nonverbal cues to people. Or we can send off the signal that we're only interested in what we have to say. I used to complain about a family member who used to, they would talk and they were great conversationalists. The minute I would open my mouth, they would look at their watch. It's like, yep, got to be going. They just talked for 20 minutes. They couldn't be in that big a hurry, but it was like, yeah, gots to go. So we can all do that and not even realize what we're doing. And so one of the things we see in this lesson is that Abraham goes out of his way to intentionally communicate his respect and his interest in these strangers. He even bows down to them as a sign of respect. And I'm not saying that we have to bow down, but we can see why the Bible uses Abraham as a role model of hospitality. And so just to